Yeah, episode 23 of Godward, the podcast. I'm your host, Casey, and this one's called The Remnant of Monologic Thought in Homer's Odyssey. This episode really isn't calibrated for beginners, by the way. Episode 11 of my podcast on Homer's use of analogies in the Iliad would be a better starting point. There's a lot of scholarly discussion about whether Homer was a single individual or merely the compiler of a bunch of songs or poems. I don't know that we can know for certain, but it does seem to me that the proper order to read these texts is Iliad first, then Odyssey. And that's because life seems to work along those lines. First, you fight the big battle, and then you try to return home, where returning home means something closer to like getting to heaven or remembering who you really are or finding inner peace or whatever. But to be honest, I could not really enjoy the Iliad until I was in my mid-30s, long past warring age. And I think that's because good warriors, and here I'm talking like in, analogy, good warriors fighting the fight, whatever the fight is, honestly, they don't read all that much often. They're too busy battling. So oddly, although the Iliad clearly corresponds to an earlier part of life and the Odyssey is more refined for the aging gentleman, it might be that the Odyssey clicks first for many people, as it did for me. I was able to enjoy it starting about age 25 or so. So whereas the Iliad is that tremendous compilation of most excellent descriptions of individual happenings, by way of powerful analogy, as I said in episode 11, the story itself, the Greeks sacking Troy, doesn't seem all that metaphorical as you read it. I suppose it could be an analog for any battle you're enduring, physical, spiritual, emotional, psychological, whatever. But it's also just the literal historical setting for the action of the epic. The Odyssey, by contrast, seems more and more to me like one giant sweeping metaphor for life. All of us are Odysseus. All of us want peace. We all want to return to Ithaca, to our homeland. But we are all distracted and besieged by many challenges, blown off course. We all make mistakes, let our friends down, lose many of them along the way. And our marriages are not always as simple and easy as the wedding. All of us need the help of the gods, so to speak, if we're going to make it. There's a pretty darn good poem by 20th century Greek poet Constantine Cavafy that reads the Iliad just as I'm going to try to here. Let me just read it to you. It's called Ithaca. As you set out for Ithaca, hope your road is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. Lystragonians, Cyclops, angry Poseidon, don't be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that on your way, as long as you keep your thoughts raised high, as long as a rare excitement stirs your spirit and your body. Lystragonians, Cyclops, wild Poseidon, you won't encounter them unless you bring them along inside your soul, unless your soul sets them up in front of you. Hope your road is a long one. May there be many summer mornings when, with what pleasure, what joy, you enter harbors you're seeing for the first time. May you stop at Phoenician trading stations to buy the fine things, mother of pearl and coral, amber and ebony, sensual perfume of every kind. As many sensual perfumes as you can. And may you visit many Egyptian cities and learn and go on learning from their scholars. Keep Ithaca always in your mind. Arriving there is what you're destined for. But don't hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years, so that you're old by the time you reach the island. Wealthy with all you've gained on the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you wouldn't have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you will have become, so full of experience, you'll have understood by then what these Ithacas mean. Isn't that good? And notice how it ends on the idea of interpretation, right? Just like the Stephen Crane story I read to you, and just like all that talk in Moby Dick about interpretation and subjectivity, at the end of your suffering, just like Odysseus, there will be a revelation that allows you to know, just like Job. Until that comes, you sail by faith. But if you keep the faith, the promise goes, you'll finally arrive. Now, people say that you can't know, ultimately. But those people are still sailing, haven't made it home yet. As I tried to show in the last episode, the mystics claim to have already seen God, already made it home, or at least gained a true sense of their bearings. This also reminds me of that very fine analogy that makes an appearance in the Philip Seymour Hoffman masterpiece called Doubt, based on a John Patrick Shanley play, which is also very good. In the movie, Hoffman plays the priest, and in one scene he is delivering his homily, and he wants to talk about how doubt can be a strong bond between us. I'm just going to read from the script of his sermon. He says, "I want to tell you a story. A cargo ship sank one night. It caught fire and went down, and only this one sailor survived. He found a lifeboat, rigged a sail, and being of a nautical discipline, turned his eyes to the heavens to read the stars. He set a course for his home and, exhausted, fell asleep. Clouds rolled in, and for the next 20 nights he could no longer see the stars. He thought he was on course, but there was no way to be certain. And as the days rolled on and the sailor wasted away, he began to have doubts. He just keeps going. Had he set his course right? Was he still going on towards his home? Or was he horribly lost and doomed to a terrible death? No way to know. The message of the constellations, had he imagined it because of his desperate circumstance? Or had he seen truth once and now had to hold on to it without further reassurance?" Okay, so that's the setup. And then he just concludes by saying, "There are those of you in church today who know exactly the crisis of faith I describe. And I want to say to you, doubt can be a bond as powerful and sustaining as certainty. When you are lost, you are not alone." So if you read the Odyssey and understand that everything happening in it is about things that are perennial and universal, it's about you and things that are happening to you. And that, I think, is the best way to proceed. Know what's easy? Being married without kids. Know what's a lot harder? Being married with kids. Those first few years, or as Tolstoy jokes in Death of Ivan Ilyich, those first few months, it's just you and the love of your life, piece of cake. The marital caresses, the new linens and silverware, etc. But then come the 20 years of separation, right? The war takes 10, and then trying to get back to Ithaca, back to Penelope, takes another 10. If you start to understand the Iliad and the Odyssey in these terms, you can understand how it is that people used to square their lives according to these texts, as Hubert Dreyfus pointed out in an earlier episode. The two epics, these two, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were the Bible to the Greeks. They contain everything once you have eyes to see. On that idea, by the way, of, as it says in that poem, keep Ithaca always on your mind. I used to have that printed in my office. That is such a powerful thing once you understand the analogy. It shapes the whole way I read the Odyssey. So once you have that in your mind, listen to everybody's favorite, Fed and mythicist, Jordan Peterson here for a second. He says,
"It's like one of those one-eyed monsters, one of those things, Cyclops in mythology. Cyclops thinks one thing. A Cyclops is like a giant penis, by the way. I mean, from a symbolic perspective, it's the same idea because it's usually something masculine and single-minded. Okay, so, and the idea is that masculine, single-minded thing is a personality that's dominated by a single motivational state. And that makes it extremely powerful and giant-like, but also kind of blind and lumbering, right? Because it only wants one thing. That little monster that you grew inside your head, which is one of these Cyclops, it's going to pop up and shut the rest of you down. And so that's not so good. And so the addiction isn't a behavior that's manifested in response to a cue, and it's not craving. It's the manifestation of a full-fledged, one-dimensional personality with its own perceptions, emotions, motivations, and cognitions that wants one thing and does not care about anything else.
Okay, so Jordan Peterson is very convinced, and he's, by the way, obviously a double-minded, cosmopolitan person, but he's convinced that you shouldn't be so single-minded, and you should basically be a pagan. You should be a polytheist. Like, open your mind, right? Like, don't be so monomaniacal. Don't be Captain Ahab. I'm going to try to, challenge him a little bit in this video, or at least, complicate things. But this is the scene that I want to deal with. It's in Book 9 of the Odyssey, and it's the one you've all heard of, Odysseus' encounter with the Cyclops. Everybody likes this scene, even when they don't see it as an analogy. It's rollicking and fun. A big monster with one eye, his sheep, his cave. And Odysseus and his men caught in the cave, they get the monster drunk, stab it in the eye, and escape by clinging to the bellies of the sheep the next morning. But does any of that mean anything? I say yes. Listen here as closely as you can to the way Homer describes the Cyclopean people. And notice how his description of them is in direct contrast to the Greeks, okay? He says, quote, and this is Odysseus talking to the Phaeacians about his journey so far. So it's Odysseus narrating. We reached the country of the lawless, outrageous Cyclops, who, putting all their trust in the immortal gods, neither plow with their hands nor plant anything, but all grows for them without seed planting, without cultivation. Wheat and barley, and also the grapevines, which yield for them wine of strength, and it is Zeus's rain that waters it for them. Okay, so far, what do we have in this description? The Cyclops are not really even civilized, right? They don't farm, and yet they seem to be fine. Like, farming takes planning and delayed gratification, which they seem not to have, yet they do seem to be okay. The gods send them, the manna they need. The food grows wild. It's a kind of Edenic existence. It reminds me of Enkidu from Gilgamesh before he was civilized by the temple harlot, drinking with the gazelles at the watering hole. And to any Greek reader, these descriptions would have seemed an obvious counterposition to the Greek ways. Greeks took pride in themselves as being cosmopolitan and technological and, excellent at farming and all that stuff. Continue listening to the description of these Cyclops people. And continue listening for the contrast with the Greeks who have now arrived on their island, led by Odysseus. Quote, these people have no institutions, no meetings for councils. Rather, they make their habitations in caverns, hollowed among the peaks of the high mountains. And each one is the law for his own wives and children, and cares nothing about the others. This is the Richmond Lattimore translation, of course, my favorite. And I love that line. It's so direct. These people have no institutions. Again, it would have been unnecessary to say so to Greek readers, but this was not the Greek way. The Greeks were famous for their institutions. What starts to emerge in this description, then, is a sharp contrast, where the Greeks are cosmopolitan, technological, bureaucratic, whereas the Cyclops are rural, pre-industrial, pre-agricultural, basically chaotic or anarchic. This distinction exists today in the difference between the cosmopolitan urban city person with his digital planner and his earbuds and his store-bought packaged food, and the few people scattered around the world who live more in isolation, disconnected, and who therefore maintain a much narrower worldview than their cosmopolitan counterparts in cities. Keep listening to the description here. Quote, There is a wooded island that spreads away from the harbor, neither close in to the land of the Cyclops nor far out from it, forested. Wild goats beyond number breed there, for there is no coming and going of humankind to disturb them. Nor are they visited by hunters, who in the forest suffer hardships as they haunt the peaks of the mountains. Neither again is it held by herded flocks, nor farmers, but all its days, never plowed and never planted, it goes without people and supports the bleating wild goats. For the Cyclops have no ships with cheeks of vermilion, nor have they builders of ships among them, who could have made them strong-benched vessels. And these, if made, could have run them sailings to all the various cities of men, in the way that people cross the sea by means of ships and visit each other, and they could have made this island a strong settlement for them. Okay, end quote. Okay, so this is my interpretation. Ready? We have talked a lot about the difficulty of discovering meaning and the way you have to earn the right to become an interpreter, etc. But I taught this text for 13 years, and by about year 10, I was convinced that I was seeing in this description of the Cyclopean civilization a sort of archetypal third world, pre-civilized people. And it's clearly contrasted with the more cosmopolitan and more conscious and more modern Greek civilization. So, the one eye of the Cyclops, the main distinguishing feature, seems to me now to be somehow symbolic of that sort of civilization. They only see one thing, one narrow worldview, right? They've never watched all those National Geographic specials that you have about the people of the Amazon River Basin or of the interior of West Papua New Guinea, like you have. They only know their own ways. They do not share the custom of welcoming strangers the way the Greeks all do. And if you contrast all this with the description that we dealt with in the last episode of the whale's head, where this is very especially fun to me with the two eyes that produce two worldviews. Here we have like a dichotomy. It's fun to work with this. I actually presented a paper on this a couple of years ago at a conference. Here's the first paragraph says, this paper is a comparative analysis of the description of, first, the single-eyed vision of Homer's Cyclops in Book 9 of the Odyssey, and second, the vision of Melville's whale with its two distinct windows. These two different ways of seeing correspond with and represent in these texts two very different psychological worldviews, the monologic and the dialogic modes. Perhaps neither of these modes is inherently superior, especially when morality is considered, but a careful reading of these two contrasting literary descriptions reveals that both authors hint that the dialogic way of seeing and thinking in the world, because it offers the advantages of cosmopolitanism and urbanism, is ultimately advantageous, pragmatically if not morally, in the meeting and conflict with monologic people. Of course, nobody said anything after I finished reading this to them. They never do at those conferences. But the point was, although the monologic worldview may have been working for the Cyclops until the Greeks arrived, it would no longer be enough to protect them after first contact with these double-minded Greeks, the cunning Greeks, right, led by wily Odysseus, who would always trick them and outwit them if they stuck to their fuddy-duddy, single-minded ways. And yet, remember, Matthew 6:22, right, which off the top of my head says something like, "If thine eye be single, thy whole body will be full of light." It does seem to me that God believers are supposed to be single-minded, monotheistic, right? Listen to this 1-minute clip.
The way to eternal life is very narrow, and it does not lend itself to broad-minded individuals who receive all sorts of half-truths and partial realities. Jesus Christ himself is the only way. And unless we narrow our mind away from the things that are false and lies, we will not be able to accept Jesus and follow him. The majority of the world receives truths that are no truth at all. And they think they are so informed because they have received these truths. Yet they are the ones that are ignorant of the truth. If you want to have eternal life, you have to become narrow-minded. But your mind will be broadened in the area of eternal life and truth.
What a great clip that is. I hope you could hear it if you're watching on YouTube. On the podcast, I'll adjust the volume, but he basically says, if you want eternal life, you have to be narrow-minded. You have to be single-eyed. You have to be like the Cyclops, not like the Greeks here. Kind of an interesting claim, and one that, again, undermines what Jordan Peterson was saying. Okay, there's a chapter in the cult classic by Julian Jaynes about the bicameral mind called Vestiges of the Bicameral Mind in the Modern World. To understand the awesomeness of that title and to appreciate my subtle homage to Jaynes in the title of this episode, you kind of have to read his whole book because he's got such a unique and eccentric idea here. But basically, he argues that the voice you hear in your head as your inner voice, as you, was in earlier times understood to be a voice coming from outside of you. The voice of a god, basically. At some point, Jaynes suggests there was a revolution in how that voice was understood. And it sort of literally stopped talking to us in the second person, and we started hearing it in the first person. And this is all helpful. Basically, Jaynes says everybody was schizophrenic until about 1000 AD. Okay, and he tracks the evolution of the mental transition from one mode to another through the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this is all helpful in thinking about the Odyssey because, as he suggests, I think convincingly, that some extraordinary one-time switch occurred between the composition of the Iliad and later the composition of the Odyssey. In the Iliad, men move as God-driven automatons, basically. And they show little evidence of having a will of their own. But in the Odyssey, things start to look very different. Odysseus in particular is able to reflect, to introspect, to consider, to plan, and then to choose. My own contribution to this thesis would be to add that to the extent Homer himself understood the shift in mental conception of mind, he portrayed the Cyclopean island and society as being a remnant or vestige of what had formerly been the norm. In short, the single-eyed person has very little agency and simply does what the gods tell him to do. By contrast, the Greeks, with their cosmopolitan penchant for sailing and their tradition of dialogue, have gained agency by gaining an ability to hold two viewpoints side by side. Listen to how Jaynes describes it, quote, "If our reasonings have been correct, it is perfectly possible that there could have existed a race of men who spoke, judged, reasoned, solved problems, indeed did most of the things that we do, but who were not conscious at all." This is such an awesome claim that, like I said, you'll have to read more about it for yourself on Wikipedia or something. But if nothing else, Jaynes is right to detect some significant difference between the characters in the Iliad and the characters in the Odyssey. I don't think that logos has quite appeared, but the capacity for dialogism among the Greeks seems to have been the tilled soil needed for logos to appear a century or two later in the writings of Heraclitus, etc. With the coming of consciousness, men are now free in the most important way. They have agency, they can think. Like Odysseus, they have gained cunning. By the way, notice even how this story sort of parallels, for instance, the whole American, Indian removal narrative, right? Even down to the idea of getting them drunk, where the Indians here would be the single-eyed and not the cosmopolitans, who would be the settlers, the Europeans, right, who came over, traded drink with them, got them drunk, and basically like dispossessed them, just as Odysseus does to the Cyclops. And there is a well-known phenomenon, like I said, whereby, pre-industrial peoples tend to be especially susceptible to alcoholism. The point here might be a very tragic one. You want to retreat. Like that's, I hear this sometimes. You want to, because America is a big degenerate empire or something. Okay, you want to retreat. You want to go full Benedict option. Just focus on God. Become single-eyed. Become monological. And not constantly live in the multicultural pantheon. Well, good luck, basically. It might work for a time, and it'll be a joyous time, mind you. But eventually, the problem seems to be some cosmopolitan sailors will show up. They will invite themselves into your territory, get you drunk, and the end result might be that you'll end up totally blind, living on reservations, etc. Okay, one last point about the Odyssey here. The book can be framed in a way that I find very provocative, in a kind of politically reactionary way. The first time I thought this was probably 8 or 10 years ago, and I couldn't believe I hadn't seen it before. But the summary of the book goes like this. It is about a patriarchal king who fights a war to defend Greater Greece, but what he really wants is to return to his own more local kingdom to live among his own people. While he's gone, a bunch of outsiders, the suitors, are literally trying to cuck him. When he finally returns, he kills them all. He doesn't even just expel them, he kills them all. When the last one of them, after he's killed, 25 of them or something, when the last one of them, a priest, crawls up to his knees, wraps his arms around Odysseus' knees, begs for forgiveness, Odysseus chops his head off while he's still speaking. Not exactly, progressive, right? We are not at the Christian, charitable grace yet. And yet this is the first hero in the Western tradition, more or less. And this is why you were only told to read it when you were too young to understand it, and it's why, Hollywood doesn't make a good, clear movie version of it, etc. Although, when Hollywood sees this podcast video, call me. My other favorite scenes in this book are the scenes of recognition. These are famous, by the way, these scenes of recognition. So Odysseus has been gone for 20 years. It's when he comes back to Ithaca. The new challenge is, how is he going to introduce himself? Now, a dummy, a simple-minded dummy, would just run off the boat and run to his house, hug his son, his wife, as many people as he recognized, and that would be that. But Odysseus is cunning. He has two minds, right? Okay, so my favorite, I guess, is the particular one where he meets his wife again, Penelope. But then after that, the one where he finally gets to see his own father again after 20 years. His dad, Laertes, has grown so frustrated by his son's absence and the attempted coup situation with Penelope and the suitors that he, his dad, retired to an orchard away from the palace. Odysseus goes off and finds his father, first sort of scopes him out. He kind of watches while he's digging in the garden. And then he introduces himself as a stranger. This is a really interesting element of Odysseus' personality. Again, where most men might run up and hug their dad or their wife, he always plays it cool. Goes for the slow, big reveal. Let me read to you a little bit from the Odyssey here in that scene. Let's see, page 351. Here we go. It says, he did find his father alone in the well-worked orchard, spading out a plant, and he had a squalid tunic upon him, patched together and ugly, and on his legs he had an ox-hide gaiters fastened and patched together to prevent scratching, and gloves on his hands because of the bushes, and he was wearing a cap of goatskin on his head to increase his misery. Now when much enduring Odysseus observed him, with great misery in his heart and oppressed by old age, he stood underneath a towering pear tree and shed tears for him, and deliberated then in his heart and his spirit whether to embrace his father and kiss him and tell him everything, how he was come again to his own dear country, or question him first about everything and make trial of him. In the division of his heart, this way seemed best to him, first to make trial of him and speak in words of mockery. So he spends the next page or so like pretending not to be Odysseus and basically like screwing around with his dad's mind, like asking him about his son. I mean, he makes him cry. Like, it's a crazy scene before he finally starts to reintroduce himself. And he finally says, "Father, I am he, the man whom you ask about." Okay, like, I am Odysseus. And it's an awesome scene. This is where his father demands some unmistakable sign, quote, "so that I can believe you." And then a couple pages later, it says, "Then resourceful Odysseus spoke in turn and answered him. First, then, look with your eyes upon this scar, and know it. The wild boar inflicted it with his white tusk on Parnassus when I went there. For you and my queenly mother had sent me to Autolycus, my mother's dear father, so I could be given those gifts which he promised me and consented to when he came to us. Or," and so that's one proof. Look at the scar on my leg, remember, Dad? "Or, come then, let me tell you of the trees in the well-worked orchard which you gave me once. I asked you of each one when I was a child, following you through the garden. We went among the trees, and you named them all, and told me what each one was. And you gave me 13 pear trees, and 10 apple trees, and 40 fig trees. And so also you named the 50 vines you would give." This just like breaks my heart, Father-son reunion. As soon as he says it, it says, Laertes' knees and his heart within him went slack as he recognized the clear proofs that Odysseus had given. He threw his arms around his dear son, and much enduring, great Odysseus held him close, for his spirit was fainting. So nice, right? Like, this is like the end of Field of Dreams or whatever, which I know you want to make fun of, but solid movie. Aristotle makes an entire literary principle out of this idea because these recognition scenes are so cathartic. They really do hit emotionally. The recognition scene, where the big reveal happens, where the characters finally understand something that readers have understood for, a while, is the closing of that gap of literary irony. So it's like, we know he's Odysseus, but his father doesn't. And this goes on for pages, and we're like, it kind of builds the tension. It's like, how will the revelation happen? And so then when it finally does, we feel this kind of closed loop happen, and it's a very good feeling when reading cathartic, revelatory scenes like this. Okay, so the way I want to read the Odyssey, it is an epic for the new era, where men are conscious, where they have interiority and agency. Odysseus is the hero of this new age, the age we still live in. As Julian Jaynes points out, there was no notion of insanity in the Iliad. And even in Plato's day, the word for prophetic and the word for psychotically mad are basically the same. In fact, stay with Jaynes for a minute. He says in his chapter on schizophrenia, which he sees as a modern misdiagnosis, effectively, he says it's basically a slipping back into this bicameral state. He says, quote, "This correspondence is also brought out in another ancient Greek word for insanity, paranoia, which, coming from para plus nous, literally meant having another mind alongside one's own." Wow. Interestingly, then, the suggestion seems to be that the Cyclopean culture was sort of a holdover from this earlier type of civilization, what Jaynes keeps calling a bicameral civilization. Interestingly, it seems the Cyclops may have been paranoid, may have held dialogue with the gods, which makes dialogue with men more difficult, or maybe even impossible if they're outsiders. The Greeks, on the other hand, having left behind this bicameral mind, having become skeptical and modern, and having, start to build the pantheon that would become the literal Roman pantheon, were by then capable of dialogue with other men because they had ceased to hear the voice of the god in their minds as a second mind within them. Homer says that the Cyclops put all their trust in the immortal gods, neither plow with their hands nor plant anything. Which sounds basically like how a schizophrenic lives, with no capacity for planning or strategizing or negotiating with others. But interestingly, Homer continues, all grows for them without seed planting, without cultivation. So maybe in a different sort of social arrangement, schizophrenia, or this single-minded, God-trusting ontology, this way of being, could be a wholly other way of existing in the world. A way that works, potentially. To confirm all this, by the way, consider that the word Polyphemus, and that's the name of the Cyclops in the Odyssey, literally means many words or having many voices. So it does suggest that there's something going on here with all this. I mean, it's not neat, but even if it's subconscious in Homer, as it might have been, I suppose, in Melville, there's this suggestion that this back and forth between like being single-minded or monomaniacal or like basically truly monotheistic, right? Where all you think about is, praying unceasingly, God all the time. That like, maybe this is a kind of ideal that could work. The problem seems to be that when you encounter, or when more likely they show up on your shores, a cosmopolitan people, right? A people of double mind, duplicitous, right? They come and they've got the ability to like delay gratification, to deceive. They're wearing the mask, right? Like they think in that sort of, in the dialogic mind. And ultimately, it seems politically so disadvantageous to have the single eye that, like, I can't figure out an answer to this. Like, I've had a hard time with this because, in some sense, I want to return to the monological worldview. Because if you're dialogical, you're a polytheist, right? I mean, this, like, you got to read your Bakhtin to kind of get down into this, I guess. But, like, the idea is, if you're dialogical, you're open to all the worldviews. This is how we were all raised, if you're dialogical. Be open-minded, respect for others. That's the dialogical mind. It's so deep in all of us. I doubt any of you are monological at this point. But, the alternative seems to be to just retrench in your own beliefs, to stop reading about the, Hindu Vedas, or Marxist ideology, all that stuff. Just chuck it. And you don't have to go that far back, by the way, into American history to find people who really did live like that. If you go back 2 generations in a lot of rural parts of America, I'm in like Carolinas. So around here, if you drive like an hour from the city, so you're out into the countryside, where there's still sort of the remnants of farms, the people living there are descended often from, or at least like the people who owned their homes, 50 years ago, went to the only church in town, which was the same church that their great-grandpa went to in that town, and they didn't think much about it. It was like, yeah, it was a Baptist church, but they didn't grow up the way you and I did with the dialogical problem sort of thrust upon them, where it's like choosing your religion it's as daunting a thing as choosing toothpaste in the supermarket, right? And it's just as consumerist. We get into this attitude in the dialogic worldview where it's like, is this religion right for me? Which puts us in the seat of judging, right? It's like, I'm going to judge. I'm the centerpiece of everything. I'm at the center of the universe, and I'm going to carefully examine all these religions and choose which one's right for me. This isn't how the monological worldview works. The monological worldview, it's like, you're born a Baptist in North Carolina, and that's everybody you know is a Baptist in North Carolina. and everybody just takes care of their own family. They meet up at church once a week. You've never heard of a Hindu. You've never met some outsider, right? Like, that's the idea of the monological mind. And in some sense, it's tempting. Like, I want to retreat to that because this pressure in the dialogical world, it's like, it's too much, right? We've all learned too much about other cultures, and we sort of like stop knowing who we are in all of that. Because it's like, what? I just get, like, me and my people are just going to get one little sliver of the pantheon, one little eighth, one little corner over there. It's like, who cares? Like, I don't want that. I want a whole civilization that is sort of us, that's like, that shares a mind. And that's what the Cyclops had. But when the Greeks show up, the Greeks who are, who love to dialogue, who are polytheistic, who have traveled the world, who make their ships with painted sails, when they show up, you're kind of helpless against them because you've become simple-minded. You've become, single-minded. And as much as like that guy, that clip I played, says, like, maybe that is what it takes to get saved even, as Matthew 6:22 seems to imply, at least if you read the King James translation. The problem is that politically you just get steamrolled eventually in the encounter with the dialogical peoples. I've tried to make this clear. I mean, I think if you read the book yourself, I'd be surprised at this point if you don't see some of what I'm saying here. Maybe I don't have it perfectly nailed down, but I think I'm making a pretty reasonable effort at expressing this idea. Anyway, that's the Odyssey, at least for now. Next episode, I think we're going to get into Notes from the Underground, the Dostoevsky story. It's sort of a novella, and it's broken into 2 parts. So we're just going to do like part 1 next time, and then part 2 in the episode after that. They're very different. And I think in about 45 minutes, I can sort of do justice to the first part and then the second part. So we'll do those 2, and then I got to get to William James still, and Dante, and those are sort of the episodes coming up. The Patreon thing is exploding, you guys. It brings a tear to my eye to be supported by people who are listening to this. So give it consideration. We had our first meeting. It went okay. We had great dialogue. I mean, man, great talk. It was like, some of the feedback I was getting is that it may have been a little too political, and that what we might want is more of a like Godward direction there. So for the second secret meeting, which happens in 2 weeks, I posted for patrons only on the Patreon page a link to read some of the Julian Jaynes stuff, and we'll discuss that at least as a starting point. So we'll be talking about, the origin of consciousness and what consciousness is and all of that stuff on the secret stream, which will be, I think, December 18th. So if you want to sign up, if you want to get in, if you want to see the behind the scenes, you've got until about December 18th to join up. I was also on Otto Poll's channel last night on YouTube. We had a pretty good discussion. I gained like 9 followers, so I'll take it. Otto Poll. P-O-H-L. Otto Poll. Look him up. He does some good content on Twitter and on YouTube and stuff. Lastly, I'm at Godward16 on Twitter. And I don't know, I've got a blog too and some other stuff going on. But you guys can find it all probably from here or my Twitter or whatever. Okay, that's it for today. Talk to you next time. Here's the outro music.